Hi, everyone. We're going to wait just a couple of seconds. It takes a little while for everyone in the white room to get in, so we'll get started in just a second. I hope you're all doing well on this Friday the 13th. We're almost there. We have a very large crowd today, which is fantastic. Excited about that. I think there are something like 180 of you, so we'll take just a little bit to get in the room here. All right. Well, it's populating slowly. Well, why don't we go ahead and start? So, hello, everyone. I'm Fritz Mayer, Dean of the Korbel School of International Studies, and welcome to Faculty Friday. Today, we have a great treat, a conversation with our new director of the Scrivner Institute of Public Policy here at the Korbel School, Professor Naazneen Barma. Professor Barma has really already, for someone at her still young age, a remarkable record. She comes to us after a decade of being professor at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. Before that, she spent 3 years at the World Bank as a young professional and public sector specialist there at the bank. She has a PhD and an MA in political science from Berkeley, an MA in international policy studies, and a BA from Stanford. And I won't go through all of her scholarly work, but she's written on a full range of international policy issues, on peace building, on foreign aid, economic development and institutional reform, natural resource politics, and global governance. And a lot of focus on Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Her most recent book is it's called The Peace Building Puzzle, Political Order and Post-Conflict Studies, published by Cambridge. She has many other articles and publications. She's also was a co-founder and is co-director of a program called Bridging the Gap, which is a really relevant program for us. It connects scholars in international affairs with policymakers in an effort to help scholars be more impactful, I think, in the end. And recently, I have to say, we just learned that she won a very nice award from the International Studies Association, the Susan Northcott Award, which is awarded to as a person whose scholarship, teaching, and mentoring advances women and underrepresented scholars in the profession. And so congratulations, Naz, for that award. It's wonderful to have you here at the Korbel School, and great to be with you today. We have so much we could talk about, and really looking forward to this. You know, we share an interest in public policy, obviously, and for me, it's let me just say personally, what a pleasure it's been to be working with you as we build the Scrivner Institute at Korbel. Let's talk a bit about your vision of the Scrivner Institute. You know, we've talked a lot about that and the opportunity we have here at the Korbel School, drawing on resources across the campus and in the community. But, you know, one of the unusual features of this policy program is that it's located in a School of International Affairs. And I'd love your thoughts about what kind of opportunity does that create for us as we build the policy program?
Thanks, Fritz. It's great to be here with you today. As you said, we've had a lot of these conversations. We share a lot of the same interests, but it's nice to actually be able to have a slightly more formal conversation with you about it. Thanks for the very kind introduction. I do feel that sort of everything that I've done in my career has led me to this place. I'm really kind of just delighted to be here at the Korbel School, to be the new director of the Scrivner Institute. And I'd love to just share a little bit about what we've been thinking about collectively. The launch of the Scrivner Institute, as you said, kind of positioning it within the Korbel School really gives the public policy program in terms of research, curriculum, and dialogue a distinct opportunity. Being in the Korbel School, of course, international affairs is really the cornerstone of how we're going to be thinking about our public policy research and curriculum. But as with the rest of the Korbel School, and the Scrivner Institute in particular is going to be building deliberate linkages from the global to local policy levels. I mean, that's the way that I think, I conceptualize, and the way that we experience the public policy challenges of our time. They're not at any one level. They're kind of crossing all of these different levels of governance. And what we're going to be kind of working on, building with the launch of the Institute, is I kind of think of it as sort of three legs of the stool of what we're kind of building here. Again, I said it just a minute ago, we've got research, the curriculum, and the dialogues. In terms of research, we're starting to build up a couple of exciting research programs on two of really the most pressing public policy challenges of the day, democracy or liberalism, thinking about it from the perspective both of sort of American democracy as well as, global liberalism. And I know we're going to talk about that a little bit more later. Very excited about, and we're actually sort of working on recruiting new faculty on the topic of inequality or economic justice, which is, really the sort of all-encompassing public policy challenge of our time. I think in terms of the curriculum, we're very excited for, some of the changes that were already put in place before I arrived here. As the Institute is being relaunched, the curriculum is also being revitalized and modernized to meet the kind of current demands on public policymakers, on, our students who are going to go on to be public policymakers in all the different spheres, public sector, in, again, different levels of government, in international and nonprofit organizations, in the corporate world, and in politics. And, many of our students will span careers that cross those different boundaries. And I think, I'm excited about, what we have kind of embedded in the new curriculum. We've got a real focus on public policy analytical techniques, both from the theoretical and from the kind of empirical perspectives. Given that, we're also going to be really encouraging our students to undertake critical analysis to make sure that given the tools that they have, they understand what the values and assumptions are embedded in those tools, so that they can be, thoughtful and ethical leaders and decision makers with the skills that they gain here. We're building out a series of substantive specializations in the degree so that in addition to the kind of core policy analysis tools, students will have a depth of technical expertise in areas like health or education policy, environmental policy, and so on. And in that regard, we're working very closely with the other schools on campus in terms of the interdisciplinarity of the degree. And finally, we're really putting an emphasis on practical and experiential skills through things like policy labs and internships and so on. And then if I could just say one more thing, the last leg of the stool is the dialogue piece of it. And when Doug and Mary Scrivner made their very generous gift to the school, to the university, one of their kind of core elements of their vision was to make manifest the values embedded in DU Impact 2025 in terms of the commitment to issue-oriented, interdisciplinary, and university-wide collaboration. That happens through research and teaching, of course, but it really kind of manifests itself through the dialogue portion of what we're going to be doing. And so we envision that the Scrivner Institute will be serving as a hub to convene public policy conversations and activities across campus in the Denver and Rocky Mountain West communities. And again, sort of on those global to local issues. And there I would just highlight something that you and I have been working closely on, and I know is very close to your heart, our new civil discourse initiative, to sort of start to convene respectful conversations around, and disagreements, because there are disagreements to be had around the hot button issues of the day. And I would just, I keep saying I'm going to say one more thing, but I really do want to emphasize that across all of these pillars, I think sort of in terms of my vision, I sort of see four principles that underpin what we're doing here, which also reflect the Korbel School's values, those of inclusion, a diversity of values and perspectives and lived experiences, engagement, which is about really being kind of, forward thinking about the pressing policy challenges of our day, being innovative in terms of problem solving and not tied to sort of orthodoxies or ideologies, and fourth, being ethical, because I really believe, and I know you do too, that public policy is for the public good.
Yeah, well, Naz, I can't tell you how exciting it is for me, but I think for all of us to hear this and to feel the momentum that's building. You alluded to the fact that we're searching. We have an astonishing number of applications for that position. I think you were up all night reading the last of that batch, and it's an exciting moment, I think, for the university, really, as well as for the Corbell schools. So very, very excited to hear that. Let me get you sort of a little bit in the weeds in the kind of policy world. I think many of us are suffering a bit of PTSD after the election. We've gone through, it was a grueling election, and I guess it's still in some ways being contested. We will presume, I think, that Joe Biden will be president and Kamala Harris vice president. But one of the takeaways is it's really kind of a split decision, because at the Senate level, the Republicans will most likely retain control pending the outcome of the two runoffs in Georgia. And of course, there's just what we saw, which is massive polarization, which has been building for years, to be sure, but increasingly polarized polity and on the major issues. So let me just take a couple of the big issues of the day. Maybe start with, the immediate are the sort of twin pandemics we have, obviously the COVID crisis and the intertwined impact on the economy. How do you see, what is the impact of this election on what is likely to happen in terms of policies to address those problems?
Yeah, Fritz, I think, that's sort of the public policy question of the day. And I think, I think what we are going to see is, a Biden-Harris administration kind of taking, decisive and dramatic action on both of these fronts. And I think one of the real, the thing, in a sense, in a meta sense, what has been most damaging to the policy conversation around the pandemic and the economy is for certain sort of segments of the political spectrum and policymakers to have framed it as a false dichotomy, right? In my view, and I think sort of empirically we can kind of agree at this point, kind of now what are we 8-9 months into this, that the notion that you either take dramatic action to end the pandemic or you save the economy is just absolutely again a false dichotomy. We have to take decisive action on the pandemic in order to rescue the economy. And I think that the Biden-Harris administration has a set of plans to move forward with that. I was really pleased to see from the public policy perspective their announcement of the slate of medical and infectious disease and public health experts who they've named to their coronavirus task force and action team, because I think to me it represents a return to science and a belief in science and not just a belief, but the need to study the kind of empirical contours of the pandemic in order to actually be able to take action on it. I've been following, and maybe you have too, an economist at Brown named Emily Oster. I think she's been really sort of fascinating on the pandemic, and I was following her to begin with for parochial reasons because she was focused on childcare and the pandemic. But I think her work is really interesting because she talks about the concept of a risk budget. And to think about how, as we think about the pandemic and the economy, that there are trade-offs, right? You have to kind of, as an individual, decide for yourself, what are the things that are important enough to me that I'm willing to take the risk of getting sick, right? As an individual, we can calculate those trade-offs for ourselves. What I think is, both fascinating and so in a way sort of has made this such a deep crisis is that it reflects two huge challenges for society in terms of public policy making. One, as a society, it's much harder to agree on what our costs and benefits are, what the values are that we want to trade off against each other. And it's even harder when we frame them as values, when we frame it as freedom versus health, or, the kinds of kind of dialogue that you hear around this stuff. So the difficulty of compromise and made even more, complicated by these very kind of ideological battles that we're having now. And the other thing that I think she has sort of emphasized, and I think of as one of the crucial challenges of public policy, is the issue of time horizons. We want to do certain things in the moment that we know are bad for the future. And how do we, again, as individuals, we can make those decisions for ourselves, but as a society, how can we, formulate what those trade-offs are? And to me, that's the heart of what public policy making is all about.
Yeah, and it is, as you and I both been in the public policy business, we're training people to think analytically, to use facts, to use data. And so I don't think it's a partisan statement to say that that's been less emphasized in the current administration. I think it's encouraging that it's coming back. And, just to add to your point, it's one thing for us as individuals to assess the risks to ourselves, but of course, the thing about a pandemic and so many other things in public policy is that the implications of your choices don't just reside with you, they have implications for others. And so how do you, as a society, take into account the spillovers, what economists would call an externality of choices that individuals make, which may be perfectly reasonable for them, but then impose costs on others. And so that's just at the heart of a lot of policy analysis, as you well know.
Fritz, if I may, you invited me to ask you questions as well, and I'm going to take advantage of that. Your work and your most recent work is on the importance of narrative in policy making, right? And to me, this is, again, I've been talking about fact and evidence, but narrative is the other side of the coin. You have to be able to tell a story, build a story about people and places that resonate with people so that we can encourage to use the kind of behavioral economist language, behaviors into the direction that we want them to go. I mean, what do you think is the right narrative for kind of trying to kind of move through this, as you framed it, this twin crisis?
Well, in general, I think you have to do both in a way. You have to do the analysis. You have to think clearly and analytically about what the problems are. But of course, most people, we don't like to do that as human beings. I mean, it's kind of painful and hard work. We like to have stories. And so then you always say that your job's not over until you tell the story. So you want to do the analysis, but then you've got to find a way to frame it in ways that people will understand. And I think in this case, a narrative around care, that ultimately you're putting the mask on to protect yourself, but you're doing it to protect others as well. And you actually hear the Biden team really moving in that direction.
Absolutely.
And if it was simple, of course we'd solve it. But I think that's the first take at the kind of story we want to tell about the pandemic. But it's we can't talk in externality terms. We have to talk about the kind of human consequences. If you don't wear a mask, it's not just about you or even your friends. It's about your friends' grandparents and that kind of thing. Well, thank you for the question on that. I'd be interested in as you look across the set of other issues that are on the plate. The Biden team has plans for everything, an enormously ambitious set of issues. I guess a way of framing this would be, to what extent do you think, given the likely Republican control of the Senate, that the kind of really ambitious agenda that's been articulated by the Biden team is really plausible? I do worry about a kind of overpromising and frustration if in the polity if you're unable to move on those things. But how do you see that?
I mean, I share your kind of assessment of the situation that, even if, I think we kind of put it sort of in the other way, even if the Democrats manage to eke out, and it'll be a 50-50 split with, Vice President Harris being the tiebreaker in the Senate, what the election has revealed is, and this is a truism at this point, is a deeply divided country in terms of partisanship, identity, and ideology. I think one thing that's interesting is when you drill down into the public policy issues themselves. On some issues, there's more common ground, and on others, the sort of polarization is even more than the election shows. And so I might just talk about a couple of different things, because I think it also is important to think about sort of where the action could come from in terms of sort of policy solutions. And even if there's a deadlocked Senate, a House that, even with a Democratic majority, there's there's deep schisms, as we saw immediately after the election in the House Democratic caucus, between the so-called progressive caucus and the more, moderate Democrats. I mean, I was joking. I think it was reflected in the reporting at the time. It's like, it's a sign of return to normal that the Democrats are fighting with each other again, right? So, but it's a sign that there are deep divisions even within the caucus. But I think that there are legislative avenues. There are avenues that require judicial responses, and there are avenues that the executive could take on its own. And so I've sort of been thinking about healthcare as something that might get sort of tangled up in the legislative arena, right? I mean, Trump voters, I think, empirically stood to lose more from an ACA repeal and Obamacare repeal than Biden voters did. And this is one of those things on which I think if you get the narrative right, there might be more common ground than voters themselves, think there is. So I remember, now soon to be Vice President-elect Kamala Harris, who, by the way, I want to brag for just a second. I was at her kickoff rally in Oakland when she announced that she was running for president. So that was in January 2019. So to kind of think about the arc of, how far we've
and you
come.
saw even then that she would be the vice presidential nominee.
And that's why I was there, exactly. To say that I was there at that moment. I remember her looking at the camera at the debate several times with Vice President Pence and counting off how many million people stood to lose their coverage if 20 million if ACA was repealed. And I think, I don't know, during oral arguments last week, Justice Roberts and Justice Kavanaugh both signaled that they were actually not, that they were actually going to be conservative in the sense of keeping Obamacare on the books. Of course, Biden wants to expand the healthcare coverage, talking eventually about a public option and so on. And I think this is an issue where the progressive wing of the party, actually, I think starting with John Edwards, a long time ago, kind of pulling the party into the public option on healthcare and so on. And I wonder if this is actually something that legislatively could move forward because of some of this common ground. On the other hand, then you have an issue like abortion, reproductive rights, where, there's just kind of stark divisions. And the final Trump appointee to the Supreme Court, Amy Coney Barrett, is the sort of, the lightning rod or sort of, of all that. It's sure to be a battle in the courts. And even, without so much has been done to strip women of their reproductive rights across the country, even with Roe in place. And so, and these restrictions, of course, disproportionately affect low-income women, women of color, immigrant women, and so on. I think it's likely that we're just going to see continued bifurcation on this. And if it ends up that, more and more states will end up adopting more and more restrictive policies, I think we're just going to see, a more and more split country on that topic. And then finally, I would think about sort of from the executive side of things, with environmental policy, there's a lot that the Biden administration can do. They can, basically reverse all the things that Trump reversed with the Obama administration, right? And put back regulations in place and so on and so forth, which would be an enormous relief from those of us who've lived through the wildfire season in California and Colorado this summer. I was reading a fascinating piece just talking about how heat-related deaths as a result of warming, of course, disproportionately affect low-income people in this country and, of course, around the world, poor people around the world. So I think that there are immediate things that the Biden administration will do, sign back onto the Paris Agreement and so on. But this is another issue in which these Band-Aids today are not going to fix the existential problem that climate change, presents to us. And I don't think that can move forward with just executive action.
Yeah, and much will depend, I think, on how McConnell and the Republican caucus in the Senate choose to play it. If they draw the lessons that they seem to draw from Gingrich's contract with America in the back in the Clinton first term, or the Tea Party in the beginning of the Obama years, or the stonewalling of judicial appointments with Merrick Garland, that sort of obstruction could be difficult to overcome. And you may be right. There's some issues that are more amenable to compromise and progress than others. But we will see, at least in that legislative path that you mentioned. But let me bring focus down a little bit more to the local level. But you mentioned this aspiration we have at Corbell, and you do, and certainly in the policy program, to be global to local, to connect these things. And there's obviously challenges at the federal level, regardless of the ambitions of the newly elected the president-elect. And we're in Denver. And increasingly cities are where a lot of stuff is happening in the policy arena. In part maybe because it's dysfunctional at the federal level, but there are a lot of reasons why cities are important. I mean, one is more and more of the world is urban in this country and around the world. So I'm curious, I guess, sort of generally, as you think about, and you and I have talked a bit about this, the extent to which, in general, cities are going to be an important part of the mix as we think about the policy program, Corbell. And then maybe even specifically, I know you're still new to Denver. I'm not much ahead of you there, but Denver's an interesting place. And so your thoughts about the opportunity that being in Denver presents for us.
It's a terrific question. It's a terrific opportunity because, like you said, there's a lot of innovation happening at the municipal urban level, kind of in general around the world. And Denver really is sort of a microcosm, I think. It's what I know so far of many of those things. And, I should admit, I still know very little about Denver per se, or Colorado politics or public policy. I'm eager to learn because I think it's a really important sort of laboratory or sort of a petri dish of innovation, as you were expressing. I came to Denver a few months ago from the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area. I've spent a lot of my adult life in the Bay Area, and I think that what's interesting about Denver is an opportunity is that Denver is now facing many of the problems that San Francisco and the Bay Area in general faced maybe 10 or 15 years ago, and I think got profoundly wrong on issues like inequality, creating livable urban mixed income and mixed use spaces and sort of all those kinds of things. You had for a long time, extremely business friendly, pro tech business in particular, urban governance in San Francisco that essentially kind of took the view that with the increased revenues that the tech sector is going to bring to the city, we can essentially kind of, pay for all the civic improvements and so on that we would want to see in place. And to the point even of sort of leaving those improvements to the big tech companies like Twitter and Salesforce and so on and so forth. And I think, that privatization of urban governance was a bad bet in the Bay Area. And I think that Denver is facing some of those challenges today and has the opportunity to take a more public approach to urban governance problems. And I sort of, the little that I know, I see that happening to some extent. But, of course, Denver faces in microcosm all of the major urban challenges, inequality, of course, a large, marginally housed population and so on, and all of the different challenges that come along with that. Well, you mentioned the focus of my research on South and East Asia. I grew up in Asia, where of course, half the world's population is in Asia and almost half of Asia's population lives in cities. Yes. And the incredible amount of innovation that has come from, I grew up in Hong Kong. I mean, talk about a city that has innovated and now possibly in disturbing ways. We can talk about that in a few minutes. But cities like Singapore and Hong Kong, in terms of things like traffic congestion and mixed income housing, developments and housing developments and so on. I think there's a lot to be learned from a comparative look at urban municipal governance. And that's something, as you know, we've been talking about with a couple of different public policy institutions around the world, London, Singapore, other places, about a collaborative program to look at some of those issues comparatively.
Yeah, I think that's so exciting because we really do have the opportunity to learn from other places. Americans tend to think we have a monopoly on good ideas. It's not true. Anyone who's been to Hong Kong or to China or to Singapore or to many places around the world, there's much we can learn from those places. And I think that's a really exciting part of what what we may be able to do in this policy program. Well, you've widened the lens now, so I took you down to the local. Let's go back out to the global here, because a lot of your work is in that. You have an international background yourself, and have written quite a bit about a range of things at the global level. We were talking earlier just a little bit about the state of democracy in the U.S., and we could come back to that and sort of flag some of those issues. But in some sense, at least it looks like this is part of a global pattern. There's a democratic erosion around the world. I mean, we're familiar with the names of Xi and Putin and Duarte and Orban, these leaders around the world. Freedom House says annually freedom declines year on year, I think 14 consecutive years or something like that at this point. Our own Madeleine Albright's book, Fascism, a Warning, looking out at the world. When you one, I guess, is this a global pattern? Is this connected? And two, where do you see the points of leverage on this? Where in what ways could we begin to reverse this if in fact this is happening globally?
I mean, the sort of challenge of our times in a political governance sense. I actually recently wrote a piece. I had a fellowship last year at the Berggruen Institute in Los Angeles, which has been supporting for a long time a really terrific research program on the future of democracy. And they asked me to write a piece on anything related to sort of, democratic trends around the world. And the piece that I ended up writing was about this question of sort of democratic erosion. It's in the Berggruen magazine, Noema magazine, a few months ago, because I was really gripped by this empirical fact that Freedom House had sort of, articulated, that over the last decade, for the first time since the Second World War, more countries became less democratic than more, right? So there's this real reversion, this tide kind of flowing out, kind of democracies becoming authoritarian at a rate kind of higher than ever since the Second World War. And I find that profoundly disturbing, right? I mean, what is democracy if not the ability of people to choose for themselves, who governs them and how they want to be governed, and to be able to change their minds about that the next time around, right? And I think it's an empirical fact that there has been this wave of democratic erosion. We could sort of start to kind of ask ourselves why. There have been a number of failures in terms of the kind of promise of global cooperation in terms of, a global rising tide lifting all boats economically. There's been, in terms of the migrant crisis from Northern Africa and the Middle East into Europe in particular, these very kind of, charged conversations about nationalism and national identity and so on. And populists, I think, have taken advantage of the ability to construct a narrative, as we were talking about before, that sort of compels, people to vote essentially for their rights to be taken away, right? And it's kind of extraordinary if you look,
isn't it? Yes.
If you look at what's going on, and there's been this interesting debate in the last couple of weeks for obvious reasons in terms of, President Trump's refusal to concede in the election to President-elect Biden, of what is a coup versus what is called in the political science literature, it's a terrible word, the auto gulp, which is an elected official taking authoritarian power for him or herself. And one of the first, the word was first used around President Alberto Fujimori in Peru, who was elected and then basically kind of turned his regime into a dictatorship. And so it matters, right? Because a coup is the opposition sort of taking power by force and illegitimately, right. Whereas the autogulp is an elected regime dismantling what brought them to power in the first place, right? And I think you see that around the world. You see it. My parents now live in India. You see it in India with Narendra Modi. You see it in Brazil with Jair Bolsonaro. Of course, you see it in Hungary and Poland and so on and so forth. And, there's this sort of scholars have called it the sort of populist international, right?
Mhm.
And the question is, to kind of get to your question in terms of what can we do about it, is I think there has to be a sort of a transnational movement against it, right? To sort of push back. And where can that come from? It can come from state to state cooperation. And obviously the Biden administration is very committed to kind of resuscitating our commitment to our allies and the international institutions through which such a push could be made. But I think it also comes from grassroots civic movements in all of these countries. And that's where the real kind of rollback, I think, is going to come, if it comes. And so from a foreign policy perspective, yes, international institutions and participating in them and being a leader, a credible leader in them matters, but also kind of dedicating resources to fact, to these sort of a Voice of America kind of, logic, right? To dedicating resources to fact and calling things out as we see them and so on. But that requires us to be able to have the credibility and legitimacy to be able to do that.
Well, I want to come to that in a second, but I want to follow up on a couple of things you said, sort of, and of course this is an enormous question, so none of us, surely have the answer. But I do wonder, you put your finger on a couple of things. One was the let's call it the sort of economic failure or apparent failure of sort of this liberal neoliberal capitalism to deliver for everyone, and inequality in the world is an issue, and for many. So the extent to which there's a sort of an economic problem, and then you mentioned migration and immigration and the ways in which that tests the capacity of societies to include others. I'm just curious whether you think, so it's one thing to build a movement, but I'm curious the extent to which you think, at the end of the day, there's this sort of these real phenomena that have to be addressed in some way if we are to reverse the democratic decline.
Yeah, I mean, it really is questions that I can't answer. None of us can answer. They're huge, and they've been going on for a very long time. I mean, these are questions that sort of led into the sort of fascist movements in the 1930s and so on. And I'll come back to that in just a second. We have colleagues, of course, at the Korbel School that focus on migration and are comparativists with much deeper expertise on those questions than I have. But I will say just a little bit about the sort of economic part of it. I've been currently working on a second edition of essentially a textbook on political economy with my former advisor, one of my former advisors from Berkeley, Steve Vogel. And in the book, we basically look at kind of competing views on capitalism, right? What is capitalism? How are markets structured? And in particular, what is and should be, from a normative perspective, the role of the state in regulating and guiding capitalism? Yep. And of course, countries around the world have made very different choices around that very simple question, right? You have American capitalism, which is, shareholder, stockholder capitalism, is premised on deregulation and kind of a business-friendly environment, and in terms of, a regulatory environment that kind of privileges business interests over the rights of the worker. Whereas in Germany, you have a system that by law mandates that workers and corporate management get together and agree on paths forward for how corporations evolve and so on and so forth. And I think the case that I want to make here is just that this is a choice. It's a social choice, right? Markets are not these magical kind of self-regulating mythical creatures. Yes. They emerge because of government support and involvement in the first place, and they progress because of government support and involvement. And I think I was going to refer back to the interwar period. The Hungarian Austrian economist Karl Polanyi, who wrote about what he called the double movement of neoliberal economics and the social protectionist forces that are sort of constantly battling with each other. And the point, he's making really sort of such a profound point, because it's not just that they're fighting with each other, it's that the fight itself makes things better over time, right? And so kind of allowing that fight to kind of play itself out, allowing protectionists and people who kind of are going to emphasize more social values like equity and justice over the kind of more market forces that value efficiency and growth, that's a conversation we want to have. That's a conversation that we want to encourage and enable in order to kind of move things, in a slightly better direction over time.
Well, I'd love to. I'm also a student of Polanyi, and I would love to pursue that more with you. But what I want to say first is, for those of you in the audience, in a couple of minutes, we'll open for questions. I see there are a few questions already in the Q&A, and so if you want to have a question, please do put it in the Q&A. Let me turn back just a little bit to this, to the trends in the global that you see in the world. One, of course, is this democratic erosion and rise of autocracy. The other is this nationalist impulse, and they go together in important ways. For two generations, the U.S. was probably the leader in building or attempting to build a global network of institutions and organizations that would facilitate international cooperation. And yet, you wrote actually in I think in an essay almost 7 years ago, you identified you called it the mythical liberal order you and colleagues who wrote this essay in the National Interest. And even then you were saying, instead of a gradual trend towards global problem solving, which I think was the dream, right? That we would have these international systems of governance, institutions. Instead, you write, we are seeing stunningly few examples of international cooperation on significant issues. That was 7 years ago. I'm guessing you don't think it's gotten better. So what are you seeing in that way and in that regard? And I guess the corollary question is to what extent can the U.S., Biden presumably has this internationalist impulse, can we resume a role as a leader in building these kinds of international cooperative measures?
Yeah, it's not something I'm happy to, I think, have been right about, unfortunately, right? I mean, it's one of these things I think we might have said in that piece, or certainly many people have said it since, the problem with the liberal international order is that was never really very liberal, fully international, or that orderly, right? And so, I mean, we were kind of trying to call it out just to say, again, it's not this mythical thing that is just sort of magically kind of works by itself. You really have to dedicate yourselves to it, invest in it, commit to it if you want it to work. What's the point of it? The point of it is to make things better for as much of the humankind living on the planet as we can, right? We can argue sort of about what's better in terms of how we think economic growth should be pursued and so on. But I think that many of us can agree on sort of basic principles that most of us would think are worth aspiring to. Mm-hmm. And so with this some of the same colleagues, Steve Weber and Eli Ratner and I wrote that piece together. Another colleague, Brent Durbin, and Steve Weber and I are now working on a book manuscript that is entitled Advancing Global Liberalism. And the idea here is that we think that we focused too much on the institutions and the processes of cooperation, mm-hmm. and like, how do you get everybody at the table, and how do you kind of come up with a decision-making rule, and so on and so forth, which is what a lot of those international institutions, I worked at one for a while, that's what they really kind of occupy themselves with, in a lot of their energy and resources. And our argument is that if we kind of go back to first principles, we can try to get more movement. And so I'm going to forget the 5 principles now, but we talk about fairness, we talk about innovation, things that, again, they may be sort of so anodyne as to, the critique would be they're so anodyne that of course everybody's going to agree to them. How do you actually sort of get there? But the idea is that these big international institutions are not the only way. That if we focus on the principles, there are actually kind of small scale more heterodox things that as a global community we could be doing in different ways. And there's a role for cities, there's a role for corporations, there's a role for civil society organizations, and kind of in a way like freeing ourselves of the constraints of what we thought all those institutions were going to achieve by focusing on what the objectives are is what we're trying to articulate.
Yeah, no, very interesting. I tend to agree that the global governance problem or the global cooperation problem is not going to be solved, certainly not exclusively by these, UN organizations or their affiliates. And we've certainly, and this interesting question for public policy, I think, and the field began as a field which really focused on governments and to some extent international, intergovernmental processes. And one of the things I think all of us who are involved in this field have enlarged our understanding of what public policy is, to recognize a role for the private sector, for nonprofits, for civil society groups, for a host of other actors in somehow together providing or achieving the public good, the mantra of this university. Well, I would love to continue to monopolize you and ask all the questions, but we do have a queue of people in the audience with questions. So let me turn to those now, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. Our colleague Ellen Winarzek is asking, what is the role of big money philanthropy as the U.S.'s risk capital in addressing societal and economic issues such as COVID and civil unrest and the like? So this good segue, because we were just talking about the role of the private sector.
It's a great question, Ellen. Thank you for it. And if you don't mind, I'm going to kind of answer it from the perspective not of the U.S. per se, but from the perspective of the economic development field, which is kind of where I come from. It was just as I was leaving the World Bank I left there in 2010 to go to the Naval Postgraduate School, that the Gates Foundation and other kind of major corporate philanthropic organizations had sort of become increasingly important and really powerful in the kind of global development space, to the point where there was an existential question facing this major international organization of sort of, now what do we do in the face of all this investment and so on. And I think that, the simple answer, which I very much believe, is that there's a role for every type of organization to play. I think there can be a problem, and this started to emerge in, around 2010. I think that we're starting to see some resolution of it, is that when you have these large, corporate philanthropic organizations working on relatively narrow agendas, they can tend to dominate the landscape at the expense of the bigger strategic issues at play. And so the question becomes, how can what forms of coordination, having just said that coordination and cooperation are not things to kind of really focus on necessarily, I do think it's important to have at least sort of avenues for those kinds of conversations. How do you kind of connect up the small scale? I mean, what the Gates Foundation is doing is not small scale in terms of the resources, but in terms of the actual kind of development activities it's doing, it is small scale. It's about, malaria bed nets and vaccinations and deworming treatments and really important things that are not about what the business of economic development writ large is about. And so there has to be some way to kind of bring those activities together. And perhaps that's the real role for these international organizations to play.
Yeah, and the private sector in general, as the World Bank used to be the major lender in this space, or the major financial investor, and in fact it's a drop in the bucket relative to the private sector now. And
let alone then the sovereign wealth funds in China and Saudi Arabia and so on, and that's a different
that's even different. Let's turn to Timothy Clay. Do you think we'll see the GOP pivot back to the concerns about debt and budget? Will they shut down the government or threaten the debt ceiling? Those are two related questions anyway.
I think it's a good question. I think the premise is reflected in the question. Probably yes, right? That we're probably going to see now the GOP suddenly rediscovering fiscal stringency and so on and so forth, as the Democrats are trying to kind of put in place these ambitious public investment agendas. I think though that And even the sort of Green New Deal, the critiques of the Green New Deal in terms of how much it's going to cost and how much business it's going to shut down and so on. I think, and Fritz, I definitely want to hear your perspective on the narrative here. I think the Dems are getting better at this in terms of making the case that this isn't just kind of, it's not consumption expenditure, it's investment. It's investment in the future, and it is the basis upon which green, equitable growth has to be built, right? I don't know how they push back against what is, I think, sure to be the GOP's sort of, rediscovery again of some of these debt issues. What do you?
We're going to see it in, as the battle almost immediately around the size of the next stimulus package, and we've seen it already leading up to the election. A kind of really rather sad spectacle of being unable to do what needs to be done here to keep the economy afloat. But that battle will be fought, and I think that the jury's out on who wins the public battle on this. I think on the shut down the government to, over the debt ceiling, the Republicans have been burned a couple of times on that. I think they're probably not so eager in that space. They will, use the debt issue again, having presided over the massive explosion of the national debt during the last 4 years. You probably will use it again in the context initially, certainly of that stimulus package. Sid Brooks asks, after you do the analysis and understand the science and data, how do you convince the man and woman on the street by way of narrative? Maybe that's for me. That the answers to the dual health and economic crisis we face require concerted and community-oriented, community-focused solutions like wearing masks.
I think we did touch on that, and I think you made exactly the right point that the sort of the ethic of care is something that deserves to be put into the public debate on this kind of thing. And I think you framed it. It's not just about you wearing a mask to protect yourself and because of that, my grandparents and the whole community, and the conversations around schools and the incredible economic, mental health, physical health toll on a generation of children. It in a way, it's almost sort of astonishing that the narrative hasn't been constructed in such a way that everybody can get on board. And you look at other countries in this regard. One of my sisters lives in Germany, and there Angela Merkel had a very hard time at the beginning, right? There was a very similar kind of, this is a decentralized problem. Why do we have to wear masks over here when the problem is over here? And I think that the German government did a much better job of kind of she was a master at talking about the rate of, what was it, the R naught, the rate at which transmission occurs, and the way that she explained it. And I think that there's been use the word epistemic closure. There's been a people agree on this now, right? In a way that there's a core set of agreement in a way that we just don't in our country.
Yeah, I think that you point to a very important role for presidential leadership in our case. And, presidents are uniquely positioned to have a bully pulpit and to articulate these things. And Biden will do that. And I think he's not a brilliant orator, but he's a very empathetic kind of character. And I think he will consistently do that, and that will help. But, the challenge in our culture, and it's actually a good comparison with Germany to a much greater extent than exists in Germany, there's a whole parallel universe of communication in this country. And, the extent to which a president speaking through the mainstream press is able or not able to reach, a sizable portion of the public who are now almost inoculated, to use it, against information they're getting from what they view as the swamp science or mainstream press, the fake news. And so that's a pretty, the challenge here is, narratives is a great thing. It's a powerful thing, but it's a double-edged sword. And there's a narrative on the other side, which is very compelling for many people. and which it will be hard for Biden. He certainly can't dominate it in the way I think a German leader or leaders in many other countries are advantaged in that regard. But yeah, I think the form of the story is one that is about care, and what we know is about telling. At the end, there's the meta story, as it were. It's about care, and then there's the specifics where you tell stories about what happens if you don't wear your mask, so that make it real for people. Deborah Bogar, back to the election. Is it still possible for the presidential elections votes to be changed by state legislatures overruling citizens' votes and requiring the electoral vote to go to Trump?
Well, Fritz, you're more of the the elections wonk than I am. I don't think so. I think at this point, I think the numbers are pretty clear, and I think that some of the key state legislatures in question, in particular the Pennsylvania state legislature, has basically come out and said that is out of the question. And so, in my mind, I think there was a danger of that, and I think the fact that we got to the place where that was a maybe small, but a distinct possibility is sort of, terrifying. But I think we've walked back from that precipice, as it were.
I hope that's the case. Just again, not a partisan statement, just for the health of the
Absolutely.
polity.
Absolutely.
Our colleague Eileen Grable asked, do you feel optimistic that the U.S. election results herald a renewal of global multinational policy cooperation, particularly of a more inclusive variety?
I really do. And I think, embodied in the coalition that brought, that voted Biden and Harris into office in a few months. I mean, I think the fact that I've been, the sense that so many more young and people of color, young people and people of color voted in this election in states where there were kind of active attempts to disenfranchise them from their right to vote, is a great sign. As many say, and as President Obama has recently said, he wrote this terrific piece in The Atlantic that is an excerpt of his new memoir, that like the hope lies in the future, of course, right? In the younger people in this country, in our students and people who are kind of going to school and doing work that is about kind of trying to make a difference. And so I think that coalition is only becoming increasingly diverse, and that the importance of those diverse perspectives and lived experiences and how we govern ourselves is incredibly important. And I think that does translate into, in turn, how we represent ourselves overseas. I mean, one of the things that the Trump administration's, sort of distrust of what they call the deep state has done is to really strip the State Department, for example, of some of that crucial diversity in terms of what the United States looks like overseas, and has, of course, deliberately dismantled our participation in some of these major multilateral organizations. And I think we know that Biden is, at heart and in practice an internationalist, and is going to renew those ties. And I think what's encouraging about the choices that he's made with Harris, bringing Harris onto the ticket, and the statements that he's made about diversity and so on, I do have optimism, and I hope that Eileen does too.
We're almost out. Let's see if we can get a couple more questions in here quickly. Daryl Stickle, who is an expert on trust, asks about the incredibly low trust levels that we have in political leaders and political institutions. There's an Edelman Trust Barometer that keeps track of this, and we're like at all-time low.
Yeah.
How big a factor is that? And that predates Trump, in fact, right? So let's be clear. This is a long trend in terms of trust. One question was just how threatening is it to our system that there are such low levels of trust in we can pick almost any institution at this point.
Yeah, I think it's an incredible threat. I think it is at the heart, right to diagnose it at the heart of many of the challenges and problems that we have faced and that we continue to face today. I will just say that I do think that, in a sense, I believe that government gets an unfair shake on this, right? I think that like most bureaucrats are kind of genuinely kind of waking up in the morning, kind of trying to do the right thing and to kind of help the society that they've kind of pledged to help, right? What be it at the local, national, global level. And I think absolutely government owes us something. Government owes its citizens something. It owes us, public service delivery, fairness, justice, and so on and so forth. I think as citizens, we also owe our government something. We owe them, more trust and more, if it's earned, of course. But I think that the narrative again has become that, in a sense that government is the bad guys and that they are not to be trusted and so on. I think we're seeing now what happens when government is incapacitated or deliberately kind of removed from advancing public policy for the public good. And so I think a renewal of that trust is crucial, and it has to be a two-way street.
Let me squeeze one more in here. I think we're just about at time. Our colleague Rachel Epstein asks, what if the problem isn't actually polarization, but rather just misrepresentations of the other side? So in some sense, it's less static. The Trump campaign says the Democrats are socialists, et cetera. These characterizations are the driving force.
I mean, I think that's exactly right. I think it's sort of a vicious circle, right? There's sort of two sides of the same coin, that misrepresentation leads to more polarization, and more polarization then leads to these echo chambers that you were describing, Fritz, in terms of the news, that leads to more mischaracterization and makes that mischaracterization sort of a received fact in the communities in which it is propagated, right? And so, what we need to do in order to sort of combat that is a return to something that we started out talking about, was a return to evidence-based, science-based, fact-based, analysis-based public policy. And for people who, try to influence public policy, from our students on up to, high-level policymakers in government, this is something that Cecilia Munoz, who I had the honor of hosting a few months ago, mentioned. She was the director of President Obama's Domestic Policy Council, that even as a very senior public official, you have to be able to separate out, when you present your views, analysis from opinion, from recommendations, and being able to say that those are distinct things, and how we kind of present those things, I think, would help to combat, Rachel's very good characterization of the problem.
Well, we could go on for quite a while. I would enjoy that. We'll do that offline for sure on many occasions, Naz. I think everyone can recognize what a great, our great good luck in recruiting Professor Naazneen Barma to join us. And again, I'm just so excited about the prospects for the Scrivner Institute, and grateful for your leadership. So thank you for joining us today on Faculty Friday.
Thank you so much, Fritz.
All right. Bye, everyone. Have a great day. Good weekend.